So my favorite part about Choose Your Legends is actually not the 4 characters that ultimately win Choose Your Legends. In my opinion, the best part about it is the fact that all of the other characters that people vote for end up in some of the top slots and have a much better chance of actually ending up in Fire Emblem Heroes. So hypothetically, even some of the little guys that you think have 0% chance of actually making it into the game actually have somewhat of a chance, as long as enough people vote for them. So today I thought it'd be fun to take a look at all of the next top slots for all of the games throughout the series, see what people voted for in Choose Your Legends, and take a glance at some of the characters that we might be seeing come out for the remainder of this year. So let's take a look. This handy dandy chart here is actually courtesy of Reddit user MegamanOmega. I'll be putting a link in the description down below, definitely go check it out. So thank you to him for putting it together. So starting off the top with Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, the top 5 characters are Anna, Zane, Nagi, Nina, and Wolf. I think Anna's a pretty obvious choice. I mean, we're 2 years into the game and she doesn't have a single alt at this point. Even Alphonse and Sharena already have alts. So that one's pretty clear to me as to why. And if you actually take a look at the Choose Your Legends results, if all of the Annas counted as one particular character, the way that they've merged votes for some other characters who didn't have merged votes in the past, if all of the Anna votes counted together, she actually would have beaten Camilla and knocked her out of the 4th slot. So I'm sure that there's a lot of people that are kind of disappointed about that. But technically, canonically, not every Anna is the same person. So I think that's kind of why they did that. Although for next year, I would hope that they actually would count the votes together, because it just really doesn't make sense. You're not really voting for different characters, you're just wanting Anna, basically. Zane, I think, is a really interesting one, and I kind of understand why people might want to see him. Basically, Zane in Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon has the ability to copycat and pretty much become another one of your units. It's kind of his special quirk. So I think that that would create a pretty interesting mechanic in Fire Emblem Heroes. I'm not sure if they'd be able to do it in such a way that's basically balanced. You know, maybe it's just for 1 turn or something like that. Maybe there's stat restrictions. They could definitely come up with a number of ways to make it work. I just don't know if there would be a possibility of them making it so that it's either not broken, but also not garbage. You know, finding that midpoint. So we'll have to see, but I do think that that's pretty interesting. Nagi is one that kind of confuses me, because Nagi is basically just an older adult Tiki, basically. I mean, I know it's the incarnation of the goddess Naga, which Tiki is pretty much, you know, kind of an offspring or offshoot of. But there's so many Tiki alts in the game already. Personally, I just don't really get the hype behind this character and why people would be voting for this character, but okay. Nina's definitely a very interesting one. Something that I'll probably say a couple times in this video is that, in my opinion, I think the best part about Fire Emblem Heroes is actually finally getting to play with a lot of the characters that were not recruitable in the original Fire Emblem games that these characters are from. So a character like Nina, who you never got, she was just kind of a side character, one of the bigger characters in the story, but not a playable character, not a unit at all. She didn't even have a class or anything. Seeing her as an actual character in the game, I think would be super interesting. I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't mind, because she, you know, it's an attractive female character, so she probably has a chance of getting in the game, right? Probably. But in all seriousness, I do actually really like that aspect about Fire Emblem Heroes, because there's a lot of characters that are actually really popular characters now that were never recruitable before. Characters like Reinhardt. In Thracia, Reinhardt was a boss. He was not a recruitable ally. There was nothing of the sort when it comes to him. I think Grand Hero battles are also really cool because of this aspect. And so for me, that's my favorite aspect about Fire Emblem Heroes. I just really love the opportunity to finally use some of these characters that when we were growing up, we could never get, and perhaps really, really wanted. So that's cool. Wolf is another interesting one. I kind of see the hype behind him, I understand it, but I'm also kind of confused too, because even though Wolf is the leader of his own little subgroup, Sedgar, I think, is usually the more popular character, because you can get a couple more levels out of him in Shadow Dragon, and I think he ends up, you know, with better stats at the end of the day because of that. So Wolf is interesting, but I guess he's kind of maybe a little bit more edgy than Sedgar, so perhaps that's why. But yeah, so if we do end up seeing a Shadow Dragon banner at some point this year, I would imagine some of these characters will probably be on it, because that tends to be Intelligence Systems' kind of method behind their madness when it comes to selecting the next characters, at least partially. Sometimes they'll throw in alts of other stuff, like for example when we got the Reinhardt and Olwen alts with the Thracia characters with that Thracia banner. That was kind of weird. I hope they don't do that again, because there's some games like Thracia that need a lot more characters and representation that still don't have that number of characters or representation in Heroes. So hopefully they won't go overboard with the alts, but they have tended to follow some of these guidelines as far as with what people want and what they voted for. So hopefully we will see characters from this list, from this entire chart here, end up in the game. Next up, for new Mystery of the Emblem, we have Chris, the male version, as well as Chris, the female version. I'll just group them together because they're basically the same character. This one surprises me, and kind of, I'll be honest, in my personal opinion, it does disappoint me to a degree, because I just think that there's really nothing special about Chris. For those of you that aren't aware, Chris was actually the playable My Unit avatar character, basically, for New Mystery of the Emblem. And it was pretty cool what you could do with the character. They were essentially kind of an early prototype version of Robin from Fire Emblem Awakening. You could select their class and stuff like that, and there were definitely some really cool combinations. You also had accessories and funny hats and stuff that they could end up wearing throughout the story, which was cool. So ultimately, I thought it was a pretty cool feature and addition to New Mystery, but I don't think that as characters they're all that great or interesting. So I'm kind of confused as to why people want to see them in Heroes. They're just going to be generic, so I don't know about that. Sirius is an interesting one. Without diving into spoilers, this would basically be kind of an alt character. I don't really know what they would do differently with this character, at least off the top of my head, but I wouldn't be opposed to it. It'd be a cool, pretty much alt character to have in the game. Next up is Malice. I actually really like this choice. This is a character that I considered voting for myself in the past for Choose Your Legends. Malice is actually the first female playable mercenary character in the Fire Emblem series, at least canonically, considering she's from, you know, the second ever game. It's even cooler to see that with remakes like New Mystery of the Emblem, even though we didn't get it here in the West. I do like it when they tend to break those kind of class restrictions, as in, you know, male characters can only be these classes and female characters only these classes. So I do like the fact that she is a female character in a predominantly male character class. So I like that a lot, and I think that she's pretty interesting as a character, so I'm totally down for Malice. Next up we have Aramaya. Without diving into spoilers too much, Aramaya is an assassin. There's other characters like her in Heroes already, and once again, she was a boss character in New Mystery, so it would be really interesting to see her end up as a Grand Hero Battle character in Fire Emblem Heroes, and I'd be down for that as well. So ultimately, for me, New Mystery of the Emblem, this list here, not too surprising, considering kind of lost 2 slots, in my opinion, but, you know, that's how it's going to go. Next up, we have Fire Emblem Echoes. This is a pretty interesting list. I do want to point out that we do actually have, I believe, over half of the cast of Fire Emblem Echoes already in Heroes. The cast and the roster for that game is just not that deep, so we really don't have that many characters that could end up coming into Heroes. I'm actually pretty happy that we do actually have so many already, but of course, I'm definitely not opposed to seeing more, because I think there's just simply still too many Fates characters. But off the top of the bat, we do have Renea here. Once again, like I was saying, Renea was not a playable character in Fire Emblem Echoes. She was actually kind of more of a side character, a love interest for Berkut. So it would actually be really cool to see her playable and come to Heroes. I'd be totally down for that. Conrad is an interesting new addition that came with Fire Emblem Echoes. I'm not sure what they would give him specifically that would make him stand out amongst other Cavaliers and Heroes, but I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him. Then we have Milla. Obviously, we just saw with the most recent Mythic Heroes banner that Duma is actually in the game, so I think this one is probably really likely. And the interesting thing too is that it kind of reveals to us that it does seem like the Mythic Heroes are actually going to be characters that are even larger, even more grandiose than some of the legendary hero characters from the actual games. So these could perhaps be, you know, final boss characters, gods and goddesses from the Fire Emblem series. And I think that's kind of interesting. I'm glad that there's that kind of difference between Legendary and Mythic now at this point, because at least originally it did kind of sound like it was just going to be Legendary Heroes, but with a different name. And, you know, they work for Ether Raids instead of more generically for other stuff. So I'd be okay with Milla. I would kind of wonder what they would give her. Probably something to do with ally support or healing or something like that, considering she's not quite as barbaric as Duma, I would say. But that'd be cool. Then we have Python. I definitely do think that archers are kind of in a weird place in Fire Emblem Heroes right now. They're really not used that often unless you're using like a cheese build. Like, I think Bride Cordelia doing the Quadelia build is actually still kind of a thing. You can still beat some of the content with it, especially if you have some really solid dancers with her. Maybe even the new Legendary Azura and stuff like that. But I would really like to see some great new archers make it in the game. It would actually be really cool if they ended up giving Python some cool bow ability or maybe a B slot or something like that, a custom personal skill that maybe increased his range or something like that, as long as they could balance it. Maybe if his HP is at 100%, he could hit from 3 tiles away. Who knows, something to make it kind of more Gaiden-esque. I do think that if they gave it to Python though, that it would be even sadder with Tobin, because Tobin is kind of canonically the first archer character that Alm gets, and he got a little bit screwed in Heroes because I think they opted to go for the villager Tobin kind of point in time that that character was in, when, you know, as a villager, he uses a sword at first, before he's class changed, basically, into an archer. But, you know, not a lot of people like Tobin and use Tobin in Heroes. He's not that great of a unit. So he got kind of shafted a little bit. But, like I said, it would be cool to see a Gaiden character and a Gaiden archer, of all things, have that extended range, because they actually do have that range, and the ranges for archers are actually really insane and really cool in Fire Emblem Gaiden and Fire Emblem Echoes. So I would definitely be down for that if they did something cool with him. Then we have Silk, also known as Thilk to some people. I do actually like Silk as a character. She's pretty cool. Unfortunately, she would definitely end up becoming an infantry cleric character, and I think at this point we just have so many other clerics from other classes that are so much better. You know, a lot of really, really good cavalry clerics that can get to places faster, and just ultimately are just really, really good and set the bar really high. Characters like Brave Veronica come to mind. So if they did add Silk, I would want to see her have something that sets her apart at least a bit. Unfortunately, in the actual game, if they do go with kind of a similar stat line to what she had in Fire Emblem Echoes and Gaiden, she was pretty slow, and that's kind of Jenny's biggest fault too in Fire Emblem Heroes, I think, because other than that, I think Jenny has pretty good attack. So Jenny would be a lot better if she was able to double, and she's just not. So if we saw Silk enter the game pretty similarly to Jenny, I think that would kind of be a problem for her as a character. I would really love to see the new artwork and stuff, but she would need something to make her, I think, a little bit better and stand out in her own way. So as long as they could make that a possibility, I would definitely be down for that. Next up for Genealogy of the Holy War, we have Larce. Larce is actually the daughter of Ira, so that's honestly kind of interesting right off the bat. I gotta admit, I don't really know what they would do for her to make her kind of stand out compared to other characters, though. I mean, they could definitely start her off with a brave sword or something like that, something that she would have had in the game. But aside from that, I don't know if there's anything that really makes her stand out so much. Genealogy was the first game in the series to introduce children units, and they did actually gain stats from their parents, so that would be interesting. I don't think that that lends to doing anything cool for her, though, getting stuff from Ira. I mean, Ira's a great unit, but I just don't think anything would make her stand out beyond that, so I'm not really sure what they would do with this character. She does come with some pretty cool skills in Genealogy, like Nile, Astra, Vantage, Pursuit, and stuff like that. But most of that is stuff that we already have in the game, and it's not really all that interesting. You know, it's not really new to give her. Although if they did actually decide to bring Nile into the game, I think that would be pretty interesting. That skill basically stops the enemy unit from using any of their skills, so that would be kind of busted unless they found a way to balance it. That would actually set her apart, I guess, or make her kind of the ultimate fodder unit, like some other units actually, unfortunately, are. But yeah, that would be interesting. But I don't know that I would want units running around with that skill. Although it might actually end up helping and kind of put an end to some of the other skill power creep stuff that we're seeing more and more in the game. So who knows, maybe that would be a healthy change for the game. I'm not sure. Next up we have Ced. Ced is actually canonically Lewin's son, and actually ends up inheriting his Forseti tome. So as far as what they could do with Ced to make him stand out a bit from his father, maybe they could give him a slight alteration of the Forseti tome and give him something a little bit different going on. But aside from that, he's not that different, and he doesn't really come with any skills or anything in Genealogy that really sets him apart. So I'm not too sure about that one. Next up, we have Altena. Altena is actually the older sister to Leaf, and she does actually end up inheriting her father's Gay Bolg. In Genealogy, she's actually the only playable Dragon Knight in the game, and she's pretty bulky and pretty tanky, although she has pretty weak resistance. Aside from all of that, though, I don't really know any skills or anything that they would give her to make her really stand out, but I definitely wouldn't mind another Wyvern Rider Lance unit in the game, so that's cool. Next up, we have Shannon. Shannon is another interesting pick. This is actually Ira's nephew, and once again, gameplay-wise, I don't know that there's anything all that interesting that they could give him to make him stand out, but he is actually capable of wielding the Balmung sword in Genealogy, so that would be pretty interesting if he entered the game with that. In that game, it actually gives a bonus to both skill and speed. Perhaps they could find some way of making it a pretty solid weapon. And lastly, for Genealogy, we have Erinyes. This is kind of an interesting pick too. She's potentially Ced's mother, and she's also a Pegasus Knight that Sigurd actually gets pretty early on in his story. Unfortunately, there isn't really anything that stands out about her as well, but I would like to see them do something cool with her. Because I think at this point, it is kind of cool to have different looking versions of similar characters, basically. You know, especially if you don't like particular units, you can kind of pick somebody else that's pretty similar to them. But it would be pretty cool to see them do something else with her. Next up, we have Thracia 776, starting off with Merida. Merida is an interesting character. She is actually the daughter of Galzus. Once again, though, another Myrmidon or Swordmaster character. Nothing really stands out too much about her. She does have a personal weapon from Thracia, which basically is essentially a brave sword, so she could end up in the game with that. But aside from that, I don't know what would be super interesting or different about her. I definitely appreciate the Swordmaster love on this list, though. It used to be my favorite class. Still kind of is my favorite class, to a degree, but that changes from time to time. Next up, there's Sarah. Sarah's kind of a cool character in Thracia. She's actually the only unit able to use the Kia Staff. The Kia Staff allows her to remove the stone condition from an ally, so basically stops them from being petrified. So although there isn't a status condition like that in Heroes, maybe they could do something cool as far as her being an infantry healer. Maybe give her a combination of buffs and heals. Next up, there's Osane, also known as Orson. I guess this is the officially localized version of his name. This character is pretty famous for using the Pugi or Puji axe, which is basically an iron axe that can be thrown, so a pretty normal hand axe, but actually really, really good in that game because it gave him extra crit and stuff like that. He also had his version of the Wrath skill. So I don't know totally what they would give him, but if they gave him Wrath with also kind of a distant counter axe weapon, that would be kind of interesting. It would also be great to get another unit that has Wrath as an inheritable skill, because it's still a really, really rare skill and hard to acquire within the game. Next up, there's Asbel. Asbel's actually kind of the Merrick of Fire Emblem Thracia 776, kind of your first typical Wind Mage that you would get, and he actually is the exclusive wielder of the Grafcalibur Tome, which is pretty much the Excalibur in that game. So they could do something cool with him having a slightly different Excalibur tome. So I'd be interested to see what they would do for that. Linoan here is definitely another interesting pick. She'd be another infantry healer, I would say. Either that or they could do, you know, an infantry mage, depending on what they wanted to give her as a weapon. She's actually the first anima magic user that you can get in Thracia. And she's also able to wield basically the Nosferatu tome. I think it was called the Razire tome or something like that. But it's basically Nosferatu. So they could do something interesting with her, but overall, that's kind of a weird pick in my opinion. Not really sure why she's that popular. Next up, Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, we have Ithune. Most people call her Idun or Idun, but that letter is actually an Eth, which is a letter used in Old English, Middle English. Basically, it's another reference to Norse mythology, which we see a lot in the Fire Emblem series. So in my personal opinion, I think it should be pronounced Ithune. This is another really cool character. Something that I've mentioned a lot as well is at some point, we're going to run out of playable Manakete characters to get in Heroes, because honestly, there's just not that many throughout the Fire Emblem series. You only typically get 1 or 2 Manaketes that you can play with on your team. So at some point, we're going to have to get into kind of the boss Manakete variety, basically, you know, final endgame bosses and stuff like that. So this is an interesting character, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did end up in the game as a Grand Hero battle. She did have Dark Breath in the Binding Blade, which basically negated the defense of all non-dragon units, as well as negating magical attacks against her, and also halved the opponent's attack power before applying defense. So honestly, a pretty powerful weapon there. They could do something cool with that. Obviously, they can't go that broken with it, but something would be interesting about that. And I think a lot of people would enjoy her dragon sprite and stuff like that too, so that's going to be a cool character if we do end up seeing her. Next up, we have Rutger. Rutger is a little bit generic, I would say, because he's pretty much your typical Myrmidon character, basically a Navarre clone, the Navarre of Fire Emblem Binding Blade. But the interesting thing about Rutger is he was actually able to get over 100% to his crit, which is kind of interesting, but because critical hits are not a thing in Fire Emblem Heroes, I would kind of wonder what they would do to him to make him different. He comes with the Killing Edge, so I can't really see, you know, there's not really a typical weapon that he would probably have or anything like that. So that one remains to be seen. Next up, we have Deke. Deke is pretty cool. He's pretty much the Agma of Binding Blade. I actually voted for him 2 years in a row, surprisingly, with 1 vote each time. There's not really a cool weapon or anything that he would have, but it will be interesting to see kind of a tealy-haired, green-haired character who's shirtless with just one arm, kind of shoulder pad kind of armor going on. So that'll be cool. Next up, we have Lou. Lou is actually Nino's son and actually the brother to Ray. He does tend to have fire tomes that he comes with, so he'll probably end up being another red unit as well. But as far as, you know, anything else with him, I'm not really certain what they would do for him. Percival's a pretty interesting pick here. He's honestly, like, story-wise, almost a Camus, except for the fact that you get him, so that kind of disqualifies him a little bit. He would definitely end up being either a sword or lance cavalier, but once again, I'm not really certain what they would do to make him stand out. Next up, the Blazing Blade. We have Louise here. Hopefully, once again, I think archers could use a little bit of extra love, so if she was a pretty solid unit, that would be nice. I think a lot of people will enjoy this character because it's another waifu. We do tend to get more waifus than male characters in Fire Emblem Heroes, so I'm sure she'll probably be at least pretty good. Then we have Nils. Nils is actually the brother of Ninian. He's another dancer character. He would be, in this case, another infantry dancer, and at this point we do have some pretty busted dancers like Legendary Azura, who can fly and give infantry and flyers the ability to move 3 spaces. So I really don't know what they would do for him that would make him kind of stand out at this point. He is also a dragon like his sister, Ninian, so maybe there's some cool combination there that they can give him kind of something interesting. Then we have Wrath. I feel like with Wrath, they've kind of been putting him off a bit because they don't want too many Cavalier archers in the game, especially after the advent of Brave Lynn. I think she was really super meta defining and a really big character. She's still a pretty commonly used character to this day, still pretty solid. So as far as Wrath goes, I would wonder if they would make him power creep her, or if he would still end up being inferior to her, which would kind of not do Wrath justice, I would say. Even though Lynn is, you know, Lynn, I do think that Wrath should have something interesting to him that would make him stand out. But at the same time, you know, if he power crept Lynn, that'd be kind of weird too. So I'm not really certain with that. Pent makes sense. You know, if we see Louise, we'll probably see Pent as well. In my opinion, they'll probably most likely be the next Blazing Blade characters that we do end up seeing whenever a Blazing Blade banner comes around again. Pent being the lover of Louise. Pent has a lot of potential. He does come with both the Elfire and Physics staff in Blazing Blade. So he could easily be a red mage, but he's also anima, so he could technically wield some other elements as well. Maybe he would have a little bit of healing power to him or something like that. That could definitely differentiate him from other, you know, mage characters. But aside from that, even though he was a really solid unit in the game, I'm not certain what else they could do to make him stand out. And finally, for Blazing Blade, we do have Athos or Athos. This is basically a Goto character, a very endgame, get him in the final chapter unit. An older character usually that's pretty solid, especially if, you know, you're having some trouble in that last chapter. So they could make him a pretty cool Sage character. I don't know that they would definitely like have him power creep everybody else or anything like that. He does end up coming with both Forblaze and Areola, so maybe they could give him a different variation of Forblaze. Areola was a pretty interesting tome as well. It gave 5 extra resistance to the user and also inflicted triple damage upon Dragon and Wyvern units. So maybe this could be a case where we see kind of a different sort of a Micaiah unit, but this time, you know, super effective against both Dragons and Wyverns. Whereas Micaiah is effective against armors and cavalry. Next up, we have Fire Emblem the Sacred Stones, starting off with Selena. Selena would be a really, really interesting character. In my mind, she's kind of relatable to Ursula from Blazing Blade, who we already have as a Grand Hero Battle character. So Selena would definitely make a great Grand Hero Battle character as well, especially if she was accompanied by these other 4 in banner form, because you know how they typically tend to, you know, release a banner for that particular game, and then also have a Grand Hero Battle related to that game as well. So that could really work out for them, actually. And I think Selena's pretty interesting. She does have actually the Bolting Tome, so that could be something cool that she can do. Maybe if they wanted to introduce some kind of 3-tile magic, but once again, obviously I wouldn't want them to do anything busted with that, so maybe there's some limitations, some, you know, HP limitations or something like that to make it kind of balance out and not be too good. She's a pretty cool Camus character in that game. I like her a lot. Next up, we have Cormag. I know Cormag is a pretty big fan favorite for a lot of people as well. Definitely one of the most popular characters, I'd say, from the Wyvern Rider class line. A lot of people really like him. He does come with a Killing Lance, so I don't know, perhaps that's a possibility here. Maybe they'll give him a Slaying Lance instead. Aside from that, you know, he's got a pretty well-rounded stat line. Can't really see anything else too interesting about him, but I think it would just be really cool to have that character, so I'm definitely stoked about that one. Next up, we have Ross. Ross is actually one of the villager characters from Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. He actually comes in a starting class before your normal starting classes, and so then has the chance to be promoted twice, which usually ends up with him becoming a pretty solid character if you give him the investment, basically. The interesting thing is that we already have Amelia in the game, and she ended up being just a general character, which was one of the potential classes that she could end up in. So I would wonder what they would do for Ross. Ross had a couple different options in the Sacred Stones. He could either become a hero, a warrior, a berserker. So he could either become a red infantry sword unit or a green axe unit. Probably the latter, honestly. Aside from that, though, he didn't really have anything too interesting about him, but it would be kind of cool to see what they do for him. Hopefully he'll come with some good skills on him. Next up, we have Garrick. Garrick, once again, another pretty popular fan character. The Agma, essentially, of Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. Once again, nothing too amazing about his kit. They didn't have skills in Sacred Stones, so there's nothing really to glean from that, but he was a pretty solid character in that game, so I would love to see him end up in Heroes and be pretty good as well. And lastly, for Sacred Stones, we have Noel. Noel is a really cool character. I actually would really like to see him end up in the game. Unfortunately, his most popular tome that people give him, Gleipnir, the legendary Dark Tome from Sacred Stones, has actually been taken by the Erica alt, the mounted cavalry red mage Erica. Unfortunately, because I think that tome would have suited him really, really well and done some good stuff for Noel. But at this point, I'm not really sure what else they would give him. He does come with Nosferatu, but the cool thing about Noel is actually that he could become either a druid or a summoner in the Sacred Stones, both of which completely different classes. Summoner actually allowed you to summon little, essentially meat shield units that you could send at the opponent, kind of distract them or play around with the AI a little bit. I don't know that they would go that far with him in Heroes. They would probably just make him, you know, your typical Dark Mage character and kind of go with his Druid class line. but I would hope that they would do something cool with him and at least make it up to him a little bit, considering they kind of took his signature tome. Next up, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, we have Ranulf. Ranulf, once again, another really popular character, the blue kitty cat, kind of the smaller, leaner cat type from the Laguz characters in Path of Radiance. In Path of Radiance, you could give characters certain skills. He didn't really come with anything in particular, but because he is kind of one of the leaner, smaller cats, it would be interesting if he did actually end up getting the 3-tile range that some beast units get, like Tabarn, you know, the flyer units. So I could see something interesting happening with that, especially because we do have the kind of thicker, bigger, stronger, more tiger Laguz characters, and we already know that Nyla is in the game and she didn't end up getting 3 movement herself. So maybe they could do something interesting with that. Next up, we have Har. Har being one of the most legendary Wyvern Rider characters, really popular character, beloved in both Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. Really solid unit too as well. In Path of Radiance, Har comes with a Brave Axe. He also has the Guard skill, which is obviously different than the Guard skill in Heroes, but it would be kind of cool if they gave him the Guard skill in Heroes just as a kind of a throwback, kind of a reference to the original Har. The Guard skill in Path of Radiance actually canceled an enemy's attack, which would be pretty busted, but actually what would be really cool if they did for him then, in that case, to kind of stay true to his original version, is if they actually gave him a Fire Sweep axe. Maybe he could be the first user of that. That would be awesome. I know a lot of people have been waiting for that one to enter the game. Then we've got Jill, once again, another beloved Wyvern Rider character. These two kind of go hand in hand, so it would be awesome to see both of them on a banner. She doesn't really have anything in particular for her as well. When you recruit her though, she does actually come with a Laguz guard, which actually halves the damage from Laguz units. So maybe they could do something like that, especially if beast units continue to be more prevalent in the metagame. Maybe she could have something anti-beast. That would be pretty interesting. Next up, we have Leith. Leith is kind of the original smaller kitty cat character that you get as a Laguz character in Path of Radiance. She does actually come with a Bjork guard, so I would wonder if maybe she takes reduced damage from infantry human characters. Maybe you'd have to damage her with something else. That could be kind of cool, although perhaps potentially busted if it wasn't, you know, a personal skill or something like that. Aside from that though, once again, nothing too different about her. And lastly here we have Ileana. This one is a really weird pick, I think, in my opinion. I don't really know why she's that popular. I think if I remember correctly, Ileana is just kind of obsessed with eating, even though she's kind of small and frail and doesn't really seem like she could eat a lot. That's her kind of quirk. But aside from that, she doesn't really contribute all that much, so I'm not really sure why she's that beloved. But who knows? Somebody voted for her, somebody likes her. She does end up coming with Thunder and El Thunder, but aside from that, nothing too special about her either. Next up, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, we have Knegas. Knegas was the king of the Beast tribe, and as such, he has some pretty ridiculous stuff. Is a very awesome unit. They could easily give him a skill like Roar. Basically, the enemy would be immobilized. This is kind of similar to what Nyla has, but perhaps they could bring it back for him as well. He also had Fortune, which negates enemies' critical attacks, but obviously that's not a thing in Heroes. All of the King Beast characters also ended up coming with Form Shift, which basically allowed them to stay transformed. The normal Laguz characters actually would revert back and forth depending upon what items they would have. In this case, that's also not a thing in Heroes either, so that's not really something they could give him and make him special. But yeah, I'm sure that if he ends up in the game, he'll probably be a pretty solid character. They can't really do the king dirty, can they? Next up, we have George. This is a really interesting one. I guess this is kind of the new meme in the Japanese Fire Emblem community. I guess over here in the West, we kind of missed out on this one. We didn't really catch on. George is actually a part of the merchant convoy in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. He's actually the one that you can buy and sell weapons to. So I don't really get what they would do with this character as far as bringing him into the game. I don't really understand the kind of meme status of it, but perhaps this is just a character kind of like, you know, Brigand Boss or somebody that we have over here that's kind of the joke vote, but ended up being pretty popular in Japan apparently. Which is a little sad because there's a lot of cool Radiant Dawn characters that could have been on this list and aren't. And this character is not even really a character. he's a sales guy, an NPC, a store owner. So I don't really know what the deal is with that, but that's interesting. Then we have Edward. Once again, Edward, a little bit generic. He's your typical Myrmidon that you would get in Radiant Dawn. Edward did have access to the Wrath skill, so they could definitely add him into the game with that. And he also had his own personal weapon later in the game in Kaladbolg, which ended up giving him luck plus 8 and was basically a much stronger version of a steel blade, and that was much lighter as well. So they could definitely give him something cool with his own personal weapon in Kaladbolg. I don't know what they would actually make it do in Heroes, considering luck isn't really a stat in Heroes, but something would be awesome. Next up, we have Sigrun. Sigrun was actually the commander of Benion's Holy Guards who protected Sanaki. And although there wasn't anything that interesting about her, she did come with a spear, so maybe they could give her kind of a distant counter lance or something like that as well. She also had the Kanto skill, which is once again not a thing in Heroes either, but I guess they could play off of that if they really wanted to. But aside from that, I'd just be excited to see this character in Heroes. We could use some more Pegasus Knights, I think. And lastly, for Radiant Dawn, we have Sephirin. This is a really, really interesting character. I won't go into spoilers and spoil the character for you, but he would probably end up being a Grand Hero Battle character, and there's a number of cool things that they could give him. He does actually have his own unique light tome in Crady Lad, so he could be a pretty powerful light mage, although they would probably have to end up giving him, he'd either be a staff user, which doesn't really make sense as a Grand Hero Battle, does it? They would probably end up making him a blue mage, but that's kind of weird. So that kind of gets a little bit into the weird territory, like with Lucius, how he got kind of screwed out of being a light mage, you know, and they just made him a healer. So definitely a weird area here, but there's a lot they could do with him. He also had the rewarp staff, so he was able to kind of warp around the battlefield. He had a mantle skill, which allowed him to negate enemy attacks. And he also had the Corona skill, which allowed him to negate the enemy unit's resistance. So definitely a lot of really cool stuff. I would hope that they wouldn't make him anywhere near that broken, but a lot they could do with him. Next up, we have Fire Emblem Awakening with, once again, Anna at the top of the list. This incarnation of Anna was actually in the Trickster class, which was an interesting new class introduced with Fire Emblem Awakening. And that class consists of infantry sword users that can also use healing staves, so that was pretty interesting. Maybe they could make her a little bit less of an infantry sword unit, kind of not have to try to stand her up against a lot of the other really great sword units in that way. Maybe she could be more of a supportive role, but I'd be interested to see what they would do with this incarnation of her. Then we have Pan. Pan is another beast unit. She's pretty similar to the Laguz and Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, except this time she transforms into a pretty big, almost kind of a vampire bunny rabbit type of deal. She was essentially one of the last of her kind. Her personal skill was Even Rhythm, which gave a +10 to hit rate and avoid during even-numbered turns. So we do have actually even and odd skills in the game so far, but obviously there's no hit rate and avoid in Fire Emblem Heroes, so I don't really know what they would do as far as skills for her, but I would definitely love to see a big bunny rabbit transformation, so that's cool. Then we have Severa, or Severa. Without going into any spoilers here, very, very similar to Selena. I'm not really certain what they would give her to make her stand out, but she also had the ability to use axes, so she could end up becoming an infantry axe user. She came with the Arms Thrift skill, which once again is not a skill that we'll see in Heroes, but basically it allowed her to have a pretty solid chance of not actually using any uses of her weapons, so that was pretty cool. And she also had the skill Patience, which increased her hit and avoid by 10 when an enemy initiated the battle. Once again, not something that we could see here, but perhaps they would give her Vantage or something like that to kind of harken back to this version of her. She's also Cordelia's daughter, so she's definitely a pretty popular choice, and I would definitely love to see her in Heroes as well. Then we have Naga, which once again is a pretty weird pick, but at this point, maybe it's possible with the Mythic Hero stuff. Naga is basically the divine dragon goddess herself. I'm not really certain what they would give her for a skill set, but probably some healing stuff or some cool stuff, something like that. Then we have Na. Na is the daughter of Noe, and once again, she comes with the Odd Rhythm skill, so not really a skill we could see here, but another Maneki I think would definitely be appreciated. There's really not that many of them throughout the series, so I'm definitely down to see a couple more added to the game. Although some of the recent ones we've gotten have been pretty powerful and kind of annoying to deal with, so there's that. Next up for Fire Emblem Fates, we have Selkie. Selkie is the daughter of Kaden and one of the Fox transformation characters in Fire Emblem Fates. Basically another Laguz character. She had some pretty interesting skills in Playthings, which was basically a start of turn AoE that damaged all enemies adjacent to her for 5 HP. She also came with Beastbane, so she was effective against other Beast characters, so that could be something that she would come with as well, especially if they do want to introduce that skill into Heroes. As Beasts become more prevalent, if they become kind of a problem, that might be something that they opt to do. And she also had Even-Handed, which added 4 damage to her attacks during even-numbered turns. So any of that stuff I think is kind of fair game for them to play with. It would also be cool to see our first Fox character in the game as well. Next up we had Valoria. Valoria is actually the daughter of Keaton, and once again very, very similar to Selkie. She actually comes with a skill called Goodie Basket, which allows her to recover 10% of her maximum health at the start of a turn. So she could end up having some kind of a renewal skill in her weapon or something like that. She also had Odd Shaped, which allowed her to deal that additional 4 damage on odd number turns. And once again, she also did end up coming with Beastbane, so that could be another option for them to play with as well for her. Next up, we have Valoria's father, Keaton. I didn't mention it, but these two are actually kind of werewolf characters, but they're a little bit more kind of classic Japanese style folklore werewolves. They don't actually look like sort of the Western, I guess I would say Americanized version of werewolves, so they were a little weird looking, but it would be interesting to see them in sprite form in Heroes. Keaton had kind of a less interesting skill set than Valoria actually. He did have a collector skill which allowed him to pick up some items, but that's obviously not going to make it into Heroes. Unless they do something weird where he's got kind of a, maybe he ends up with like a Beast SP skill or something like that. That could be interesting. He also did have Beastbane and Odd Shaped once again. Then we have Rinka, and this is definitely one that I'm actually surprised is not already in the game, because she's a pretty interesting character, and clearly a pretty popular character from Fates as well. She would end up being an infantry axe unit, I think, and her personal skill in Fates is actually Fiery Blood, which gives her an additional 4 damage if her HP is not full. So perhaps she could be kind of a berserker type of a character and do a little bit more damage when her HP is not 100%. And lastly, once again for Fire Emblem Fates, we do have Anna. So clearly Anna was a pretty popular character this time around. A lot of people want her to get an alt. This version of Anna is Outlaw class. She has a bow. Aside from that though, her kit is once again not something that could end up being in the game. She's got skills like Lock Touch, Movement +1, stuff like that. I guess they could end up giving her an extra movement with some weird condition, but aside from that, I'm not really certain what they would do to make her interesting either. And then lastly, we've got characters from Fire Emblem Heroes with Bruno, who has some plot relevance, but I guess people just want to spread a little bit more love now that we do actually have our own version of Veronica. But this version of Bruno, at least if they stuck with kind of the original kit that he started with in the game, he would end up coming with Velasquialf, which is a blue tome. He's a blue cavalier, and that enables him to at less than 50% HP to strike first, even when attacked. So he basically has Vantage built into his spellbook, so that's actually kind of interesting. I think he would make a pretty cool unit as well. Then we have Leaf, Thrazier, and Hel, brand new characters introduced with Book 3, all of them being different classes, of course, Leaf being a Red Sword Infantry. His Sokvabeker sword actually grants him the ability of, if he's within 3 spaces of an ally, grants attack speed, defense, and res +4 during combat, which is pretty nice. And unit makes a guaranteed follow-up attack, but after combat, if attacked, deals 20 damage to nearest ally. So that's a really, really solid weapon there. It's honestly kind of broken in a sense. There's a lot going on with that. He's got his own kind of goad or spur buff built into there, as well as a guaranteed follow-up attack, but you also deal 20 damage to a nearest ally. But I could definitely see that being abused in Heroes, especially if we do end up getting him with that weapon, because that 20 damage to the nearest ally could be easily manipulatable. You can make him deal damage to somebody with, Vantage or Desperation or a skill like that that can definitely pop off after that, especially if it's a Glass Cannon Mage. So I think that's a little too good for us to get. I don't know that they would do that necessarily, but who knows. Then with Thrazier, she is a Green Tome Infantry unit. She comes with the spellbook Efinger or Eifinger, which is effective against dragon foes, and if the unit is within 3 spaces of an ally, once again that attack speed, defense, and res buff during combat, and disables foes' skills that guarantee foes' follow-up attack. So once again, negating stuff like enemies' quick riposte, but after combat, if attacked, she inflicts attack speed, defense, and res -4 on nearest ally through its next action, so a debuff on your own unit as well. So it's kind of cool how these Hel characters have a bit of a downside to their weapons, but they're also still really, really good. Hel is a flying axe user that has her own Hel Scythe, which accelerates the special trigger, so cooldown count -1, basically the slaying effect. And if foe does not use magic or staff, calculates damage using foe's res, and if unit's HP is over 1 and foe would reduce unit's HP to 0, survives with 1 HP. So a bit of a miracle effect built in there as well. Not that great, but it's kind of cool to see a lot of stuff happening in her weapon as well. And considering the fact that we did end up getting Surtur, I guess it is kind of more of a possibility that we do see Hel at some point. Though I don't think Hel will be as menacing as Surtur, unless they give Hel her own busted personal skill to go alongside this stuff as well. So that's going to do it for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed speculating upon future Fire Emblem Heroes characters here with me, and we'll probably end up seeing some of these guys throughout this year, maybe even early next year, as they kind of flesh out, do different banners and stuff like that, and consider some of the top characters that people clearly want to get into the game. So we will, in fact, most likely see a good amount of these characters in the game, and we'll probably end up getting a Farfetch'd banner or something like that that does compile a lot of these popular characters as well, maybe even a mix and match from a bunch of different games, considering that's what they've done before with Farfetch'd banners. If you enjoyed this episode, though, do me a solid and slash that thumbs up down below. Definitely let me know which characters you're most excited for if these characters do end up getting in the game. Which ones are your favorites? Which ones do you want to see? And why? Once again, shout out to all of our amazing patrons. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you haven't already, get subscribed if you want to see more content like this. Also, follow us on Twitter if you want the latest news and updates, especially related to Fire Emblem Heroes and Fire Emblem Three Houses. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode.